اغفر لنا ذنوبنا لقد ظلمنا أنفسنا ولا غافر لي ذنوب إلا أنت فنتوجه إليك ونستغفرك ونتوب إليك والعصر إن الإنسان في خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. So now we go into chapter 3, which, as we had experienced before, is probably one of the more difficult chapters to confront because of the high philosophical um, content. And we discovered that some things are more clear in the Arabic versus the English. And I think that that was mentioned on a number of occasions. So our trajectory then is to finish this chapter and then leapfrog to chapter, I believe it's 10 and 11. I'm just making sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Even if we were to do 9, 10, and 11, it would be a good idea. But I think, given the fact that we spent so much time on on the other two chapters,
Mm-hmm.
it's probably better to leapfrog to 10 and 11. The idea in chapter 9 is a very important idea because it deals with the issue of meaning in language and how it is that the Quran employs language. But I think that it's not that difficult to study, not that difficult to kind of to get the point. Yeah, and we can summarize it in the concept that every usage of language in the Quran is intentional. And that being the case, we should pay attention to the language of the Quran and why is it that this word is being used and why is it that this particular particle is there. And I think it summarized the point is summarized in that idea that the language of the Quran is intentional. Don't underestimate that intentionality. Don't confuse the Quran for uh, using synonymous language. What that means is that one word can replace another word. Don't think on those terms. Think on the terms that no word in the Quran can be replaced. So when Allah Ta'ala is utilizing or employing a specific word, it's very intentional. And um, and there's no other way in the design of the Quran in that regard is there. Chapter 3. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Prophecies of the Quran. The idea of the prophecies of the Quran is to point out to the uniqueness of the Quranic message and to also go out on the lines and to say that to go out on the line to say that the prophecies of the Quran, some that took place prior to the transitioning of the Prophet Muhammad والسلام, from this world to the hereafter, and some took place after his transitioning. That was a way to prove the Quran as being false. If the Prophet والسلام, was the author of the Quran, definitely it would have been more problematic in that someone is claiming something is coming from God and then claiming that God uh, gave them knowledge of events that were to come, and then those events didn't come true. The fact that those events didn't come true invalidate the authenticity of that person's claim. In 2000, Maulana Kabani, Naqshbandi, he was very popular here in the US. I forget his name in total. Uh, Hisham Kabani, what was his name?
Mm.
No, it wasn't Hisham Kabani. Sorry, no, it wasn't Hisham Kabani. It was let me see what Sheikh Nazim. That's what.
Sheikh Nazim, yeah.
Yeah, Sheikh Nazim. Sheikh Nazim. He claimed in 2000 that it was going to be the end of the world, and he went to. He told people to get water and go overseas, and they were waiting for the return of Jesus. Does anybody remember that?
Yeah, I actually remembered his. I remember watching him in 2012, or it was around the Arab Spring. Actually, it was the uprisings in Syria and Egypt, and he was he was making. I think this was like he met with the Pope, and then after some time, I remember like seeing like people go visit him in Cyprus. They would go to his house, and he would give these uh, prophecies of these wars that were about to happen, and that the Mahdi is coming and all that stuff. So I remember like this was like probably 10, 11, 12 years ago when because it was at the height of all the stuff going on in the Arab world. Uh,
Right, and that's one of the reasons why, you know, unfortunately, people like Jibril Haddad, who Jibril Haddad really has some scholarship to him. Um, but he comes from very strong Catholic background, very anti-Salafi, very aware of what's happening. I remember that he used to monitor my blog as well as that of our blog was mine and Suhaib Webb's at that time when we were blogging together. This was years back. So they're aware of kind of what's going on and who's saying what, but that idea of prophecy, as a matter of fact, it used to be on the Wikipedia. They took it off. Uh, they took it off that he had made that claim. You know, now they have it like 2050 and some other pages or something like that. Um, let me
I
see
actually
something.
visited. I actually visit. I went to North Cyprus a couple years ago, actually, and I went to their um, what they call it, the Tikia. That was like
Hmm.
I went to the Tikia, and where he was buried. It's really interesting to see. They have like the people that service that masjid in that community, and it was
He would, yeah. What was interesting about it?
no, for me it was just I've never been to it was like my first time ever going to like Naqshbandi, like Sheikh Nazim, like type of Sufi type of place, like because I entered, I noticed that they had Sheikh Haqqani, like their pictures, it's on the entrance. Before there's no pictures inside, but like before you enter, like in the hallway, there was the pictures of Sheikh Nazim and Haqqani, and I think I don't recall the name of the current Sheikh, but it was I didn't really get to stay a lot. I only stayed for a couple hours. Um, probably stayed for like maybe for a half a day actually, 4 or 5 days, and I was with my wife, so they took her to the woman's side, and I just stayed, and it was nothing, um, but I was just I was talking with the brothers there of like how people come from all over the world to like they'll stay there for months or years, um, and they'll accept anybody. You don't need any money to be there. Like you could stay there and they'll take care of you and all that. So, but I didn't get really to experience any. There was two. There was an American brother that like he converted to Islam in the 70s. There was some brothers that were Canadian too uh, that they just picked up and moved there, and so I mean other they told me to go like make dua by his grave, you know what I mean, which is a first time for me to you know like not make dua, just like this is his maqam, like his maqam, and like it's like a blessed area, make dua over so that your du'as could be accepted. Not to make dua to him, obviously, but to Allah Subhanahu wa Taala. But yeah, it was nice to go and see that type of thing.
Yeah, the whole the masajid, to be honest with you, that have that kind of flavor. You have them in Egypt too. They have a lot of activity. They stay busy in a different way. It's not a busy like always like a family type of thing, but it's a busy kind of like they have their own programs, better programs. Men and women come in and out. It's not necessarily like kind of like an Islamic center in that way, but it does have its own flavor. But the point was that he made that claim that 2000 the world was going to come to an end, or it was attributed to him. Remember during that time, people were waiting, and uh, and see that's one of the things. That's one of the things that it's a proof of a person's limited insight. And the Prophet Ali Salatu Wasalam could have fallen into that type of thing if he was not receiving wahi from Allah Ta'ala. It was just like a religious leader that was guiding the people, and the Quran itself, would have been invalidated. with time, and that's the point of the scenarios and so on and so forth. With time, our positions become invalidated. Here it says the question of the prophet having nothing to do with the writing of the Quran is too self-evident. He uh, established that point in chapter 2. So he's connecting here. Here's chapter 2 connects with chapter 3 in that point that the Prophet والسلام, is not the author of the Quran. That's the main thesis of chapter 2. It is definitely sufficient to prove a person's innocence of a particular action of commission that his very nature shows his physical inability to do or produce it. So that's an interesting uh, position to take. You know, that the character of the person and capacity of the person doesn't allow them to engage in those types of actions. I'm not sure. The problem with that is like not to be a person of doubt, but okay, you may not be the only thing that you can kind of you yourself may not be capable, but what about if you appoint other people? Now we know that there were other people that wrote in the time of the Prophet from the Sahaba. I think that the Prophet's truthfulness, you know, why would he hide that fact? You know, at that point, then, if he knew how to write, why would he hide the fact? You know, that, and why would the emphasis be on him being unlettered? You know, because the non-Muslims, they entertain that type of thing. You know, the non-Muslims, they have a really negative view of human nature. And so the question comes up here, well, what's the evidence that he was the author of the Quran? And when we look at the Quran itself, we see too many instances in which Allah wa ta'ala is correcting the Prophet. We see instances that are not consistent with someone that is hiding something or trying to make themselves shielded from the accusation that they're the author of the Quran. You know, you have to be a master liar at that point. If you're the author of a book and you're a major addressee in that book, the book is being addressed to you. You know, you have to be on some very high level mental stuff to like split yourself in two parts. One part is correcting you. You know, why did you do that? And the other part is like, you know, well, I'm sorry. You know, it's like you get what I'm saying when you see the kind of the two role thing. Who's the main author and who's the recipient? You know, or is the author and the recipient the same? And that was what Abdullah Daraz wanted us to think about, because the non-Muslims had accused the Prophet ﷺ of being the author of the Quran. And so then that would that would cause, if the Prophet ﷺ was the author of the Quran, it would cause uh, the Prophet to have a split personality. The one that's presented to the people, and then the one that's given this information, and you just don't see that. That's a tenable position, if that makes sense. But here, he's not talking about psychology. He's talking about that there's no uh, verbal admission. You don't see anywhere that he's claiming to be the author of the Quran. And neither is it consistent with his character to have written the Quran and concealed it. And then that's it. He's almost making a court case. And then he says, it's definitely sufficient to prove Sheikh Abdullah Daraz is making a court case. It is definitely sufficient to prove a person's innocence of a particular action of commission, that his very nature shows his physical inability to do or produce it. As a matter of fact, the reality of the situation, people, is that the idea of criminality wherein someone is prone to crime is an engineered concept. I remember studying, because I had studied criminology. I remember years ago, this was like a clear thing that was being debated. I don't know where that science is at today, but it was heavily debated. But one of the things that is done in today's time, despite the fact that the idea that a person is an inherent criminal by genes, right? That a person is born a criminal. One of the things that's done is to look at the character of the person. And so one time a police officer was telling me that the surveillance systems that are, like, say, for instance, in the city of Philadelphia, the surveillance system is not necessarily a deterrent for many people. But what it does is it allows them to collect data. And then when you look at the zip code, you see people in that particular area with a particular background, particular character at this point. And what I mean by background here is criminal record. And so if there was a robbery, they can look and see who in the area has robbery history. And along with the other information, such as video footage, they may be able to match up that specific person based on their character with a particular crime that took place, because they're said to have an inclination toward that crime based on their character, and their character is documented in their criminal history. Does that make sense or not really? Or am I saying something that's confusing?
So what you're saying is, based on the environment and the demographics, they label certain people to have more of a disposition to committing a crime?
Yep. Just a person can be self-controlled, but by the fact that by the fact that they have their criminal history, and then there's they live in close proximity to something that happened and they have some evidences, they can bring those things together and blame that person. Does that make sense or not really?
Mhm. But isn't that
So
kind of what the Aces does?
yeah, ACEs does something similar. ACEs does something similar from the angle that ACEs says if these things happened and we can prove that they happened in your life, then there's a possibility that out of these types of things happening in your life, you're going to be this type of person,
Mhm.
or you're going to have these types of struggles. The idea here of saying this is that uh, personality and character, there's ideas about those things, and they're pretty much used to predict the person's behavior. Sheikh Abdullah Daraz is drawing on the same concept. Personality and character of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. It's a very contemporary argument, but it's very old as well. It just doesn't, open up to the idea that he would lie about being the author of the Quran. If he was the author of the Quran, more specifically, that he would lie about it. Does that make sense or not? So he extends that he says, let us now reflect on whether Muhammad, the unlettered prophet, could have produced the Quranic concepts and meanings on the basis of his knowledge and intellectual means. Then he starts off, he says, atheists who have no shortage of ignorance, right? Uh, I don't think that the Arabic reads 100% like that because it's a generalized claim. Went to this last time. It's a generalized claim. In that type of generalized claim, I think the language is a little loose to box in all the atheists. As a matter of fact, many atheists today would claim to be pretty intellectual. Anyway, one thing that I realized from last time is that the difference in the organization between the English and the Arabic, there is somewhat of a distinguishing feature. The way that he organized the way that the book is organized in Arabic, we mentioned that before, that everything kind of flows and is interlocked, and that is lost somewhere in the English. Is lost in the English. But he says atheists who have no shortage of ignorance. I wouldn't I wouldn't speak about a group of people in that way, right? Because that's taking away from the uh, intellectual position that you want to take. You know, atheists who have no shortage of English will claim that he could. They would argue that his innate intelligence and penetrating insight enabled him to distinguish right from falsehood, decent morals from foul ones, and good from evil. They would even go further and claim that if there was anything in the heavens which could be grasped by deep reflection or sound nature or inspiration, Muhammad would have grasped it, given his undistorted nature, great intellect, and profound abilities for reflection. Now, the more core thing is everything in the Quran reducible, or here it says deducible by reflection and contemplation? Is it the product of reflection and contemplation? Can it be reduced to just, nice thoughts? Or is there something that one can feel and experience? He says, certainly not. We will find in the Quran a substantial portion. In other words, now there's a point to examine the contents of the Quran that can never be gathered by simple intelligence or contemplation. No one who was not present at the time when historical events took place could have full knowledge of them except through study and learning. So, what can such atheist people tell us about what the Quran relates of the history of former nations and the accurate details it gives of such events? Can history ever be formulated through deep thinking or accurate insight? And so the idea here is that it, history is not the history is having to do with facts. So he's going into a very deep reflection to continue the point that the Prophet ﷺ is not the author of the Quran. The question comes up, is the Quran just a byproduct of a person's deep thinking and reflection upon life? And he begins, Sheikh Abdullah Daraz, by saying, no, look, there's historical knowledge that's being referred to make points about morality. And then he's saying that history, in this case, it can't just be the byproduct of somebody's thinking, right? Hold on a second. Hold on one second. Let me take this call. So this is an emergency call. Hold on. Earlier, I'll be right back.
Okay.
Did we lose everybody? Okay. Did we lose
No,
our?
Brother Tariq and Wafa are online.
Okay, sorry about that. So the argument. Hold on one second. Hold on one second. So, Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. First of all, like I mentioned before, um, the way that this is translated, it's not going to work into our favor to do an ad hominem. And an ad hominem is when you attack a person directly. Like, so for instance, atheists who have no shortage of ignorance. That's not a, it's the first thing that is began with, the section begins with. That approach is not good. We stay with the ideas. And I'm not so sure that Sheikh Abdullah Daraz said that. It's possible sometimes the ulama, they slip, they kind of talk like that. But in reality, we have to stick with the realm of ideas. Now, the claim is nice. And I could see an atheist make the claim that the Prophet ﷺ was just a very advanced intellectual and spiritual soul. Or maybe they would have used the language, a very advanced intellectual and self-reflective person. That's a nice argument. It opens up, or that's a nice position to take. It opens up for building an interesting argument on prophethood itself. The thing about this is that the reality of the situation is that when you look at ilm al-kalam, the Mu'tazila and the Maturidiyya, and the position of Ibn Taymiyyah as well, is that the intellect, reason, can get us to a place where we can understand right and wrong. We see that in the world. The Ash'ari school is not of that position. To me, it's not a logical position in this case that the Ash'aris take. And I'm not claiming to judge the Ash'ari school. It's just a position that I don't follow in this regard, because they don't believe that the intellect has the possibility of distinguishing or considering right or wrong in the same way that the Maturidi school and Ibn Taymiyyah and even the Mu'tazila claim. I think that when you look at the Gaza situation, when you look at many situations on the everyday, people have a sense of right or wrong. Even if you don't want to make the claim for fitrah, which also can sometimes be problematic in this environment because of so many ideas of human nature that exist. But the Quranic position and the Islamic position in general, meaning the thinking that comes from the Muslims as well, not just the Quranic position, and you find it also in the Sunnah, that the human being is born on fitrah, and fitrah is the natural inclination to what is good. The human being is essentially good, and the human being's nature is distorted by in education, especially environment, and so on and so forth. So this point, I don't think that we even disagree with this as Muslims. That intelligence and penetrating insight allow us to distinguish a right and wrong, allow us to distinguish decent values from foul ones, good from evil to some extent. So I would include us in that at the level of reason, we believe that it's possible, right? We believe that it's possible. So they would even go further and claim that if there was anything in the heavens which could be grasped by deep reflection or sound nature or inspiration, Muhammad would have grasped it. That's not something different than, for instance, the Buddhist or the philosopher or so on and so forth. All of that is known that there's people like this in the world that reflect and they come to truths of life, or they uncover the reality, of the moral position or the ethical position in certain situations. The question is there something more than just reflection, deep insight, and spiritual achievement that comes through self-discipline? This question comes up of spiritual achievement. What can be achieved on your own when you start doing comparative religion? I remember that there was a story between, that the Hindus, they have a group among them that's called the sadhus. And the sadhus are people that engage in fasting, and they engage in a lot of different exercises to discipline themselves, deep meditation. Remember that Buddhism originated with Hinduism. It was Buddhism was originally was an offshoot of Hinduism. And the Buddhists are well known for deep meditation and so on and so forth. So the argument came up that in India, you have Muslims that are people of ibadah as well, people of meditation and so on and so forth. And so some of the Mashaykh began to discuss there's just there's some things that they kind of like, it's about human achievement, concentration, you know what I'm saying? Control of your desire. And once you control your desire and you have concentration, what can you achieve? You can achieve certain things. When you control your desire, you control your concentration, you can develop your intuition. Women have intuition. It's a stereotype, but it's true. Women have an intuition. Men have it too, but men don't always hone it. They don't always hone it, whereas women hone it. They can feel certain things. They can feel certain vibrations and so on and so forth. So those things, in some way, Sheikh Abdullah Daraz, is saying like, let me come back a little bit, because I didn't clarify the point that I was making. The Mashaykh in India, they were saying like there's a level that you can reach in spirituality that is about your effort. It's about your commitment. It's about your work. But there's a relationship that we have with God that's a gift that's given. It's not about our effort and our work, right? It's not about our effort and our work in that regard. Just like you exercise your muscles, there's a difference between a person that is going to the gym, hitting the gym every day, and they're physically fit, but they believe that all of that comes from Allah, that the heart is pumping because of Allah. And there's another person that believes because of health. The other person may achieve a lot, maybe more than the person that believes. We see that nowadays. You know what I'm saying? But the difference is that issue of belief, and then there's experiences that we all can have in common. You know what I'm saying? People can have dreams where they can see into the future and may come about. They can have intuitions that may come about. Sheikh Abdullah Daraz is about drawing that common ground. There's no doubt about that. The thing that I'm making here is I'm pushing this even further. Versus, and I believe in part this is coming from the translator, versus, being so oppositional like this, atheists who have no shortage of ignorance. Just draw the common ground, just like the scholars did in the past. Like, okay, this is where we can agree with them, and this is where we disagree with them. Where we agree with them is that it's possible for the human being to achieve a lot when there's discipline on the part of the male and the female to think and to reflect and to control their lower desires. They can go to high spiritual heights. Now the question comes, that knowledge which can be achieved by reflection and spiritual work and thought, contemplation, and so on and so forth. Is the Quran the byproduct of just a very well accomplished human being on the spiritual level and on the intellectual level, one that is emotionally intelligent, as we would say in today's time, spiritually intelligent? That's a very good question. It's a very good question. So here it says, we believe that his qualities and his characteristics are far more splendid than what atheists credit him. I don't know if I like the language. I think we can say that we can go with the thesis that the prophet was a well accomplished being. You find that in ilm al-kalam. One of the qualities of a prophet is sound intellect. As a matter of fact, it should be kind of above average. Sorry about the Starbucks cup, but they gave this to my wife, and so I'm using it. Although we've been boycotting Starbucks. So here, the reality of the situation is that we have to distinguish: is the contents of the Quran just intellectual niceties and deep thoughts about the world and about life, or is it something more than that? So then he says, we find in the Quran a substantial portion that can never be gathered by simple intelligence or contemplation, profound as they may be. No one who was not present at that time when historical events took place, could have full knowledge of them except through study and learning. So there's certain things that were said in the Quran that only could come about with studying and learning, and not just nice systematic reflective thought. The source of that knowledge would require someone to be taught. So then he says, what can such atheist people tell us about what the Quran relates of the history of former nations and the accurate details it gives of such events? Where did that knowledge come from, in other words? But to be honest with you, I'm like this. Even the Muslims themselves, it's at the top of the page. What can such atheist people tell us? Muslims themselves don't know this stuff. So when you ask a Muslim, you believe in the Quran, one of the 6 cornerstones of Iman is belief in the books, al-Iman bil Kutub. That's one of the 6 cornerstones. Okay? Do we really know what that means? We say, yes, the books that came before, they were distorted and the Quran is preserved, that type of thing. Sheikh Abdullah Daraz, at this point, he's not allowing us to just say we believe in the books. He's forcing us intellectually to really know what we're saying when we say we believe in the Quran, right? And so we believe that in the Quran, that can, when we say we believe in the prophets, he's forcing us to show how it is that we believe in the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. And of that belief is being able to distinguish between the Prophet and the Quran. What does it mean to be a prophet? And what does it mean for the Quran to be the Quran? Right? That's necessary knowledge, especially for all of us who we've been in the university. It's necessary for us to have a more grounded, rooted understanding of these cornerstones of belief. So here, he's distinguishing between deep thought and spiritual reflection and these events. Now he's drawing on history once again. This is pretty much people like kind of like the style of the muhaddith. The muhaddith is going into the authentic transmission of information. So history is transmitted and is telling us things about events that took place. Can history ever be formulated to deep thinking or accurate insight, or would they go as far as to claim that Muhammad lived among those communities of former times, moving among them and witnessing these events as they took place? Or had he studied the books of former authors so deeply that he learned every little detail in them? The issue of the details is what makes these facts, these historical facts, valuable. Okay, and he's bringing up these stories. They cannot make either claim because they, as well as the whole world, realize that neither situation applies to Muhammad. You were not with them, the Quran says, when they drew lots as to which of them should be Maryam's guardian. You were not with them, Yusuf's brothers, when they resolved upon what they were going to do and wove their schemes against them. You were not on the sunset slope of Sinai when we imposed the law upon Musa, والسلام, nor were you among those who witnessed his times. The Quran itself is distinguishing what type of knowledge and experience the Prophet had. You have never been able to recite any divine book before this one was revealed, nor did you ever transcribe, right, with your own hand, or else they who try to disprove the truth of your revelation may indeed have had cause to doubt it. These accounts of something that was beyond the reach of your perception, we now reveal to you, O Muhammad, right? For neither you nor your people knew them fully before this. And the measure that we reveal this Quran to you, we explain it to you in the best possible way, seeing that before this Quran, you were indeed among those who are unaware of what revelation is. You have to be on some level of connivingness to embed in the book that is written by your hands these lines which disassociate yourself from it. You get what I'm saying? Like, this is advanced textual analysis in today's time when you do literary criticism type work to distinguish the voices in the text itself. You know, even though some may say, well, the Arabs were pretty advanced with language. They were that bad. They were people that were very literate and very refined in communication of ideas and expression of thoughts and so on and so forth. You would have to have comparative literature studies. So you would have to compare all of the writings of the Arabs of the past that were there, or all of their works that they don't necessarily have to be in writing. And this is one of the reasons why we study Arabic poetry, people. The reason why we study the poetry of Jahiliyyah is to understand the Quran and to see, especially when we study the what they call arud, poetic meter, is to understand the patterns and the flows, and you just don't see the flow of the Quran in the same way. That could have been one of the argument points that was made by the non-Muslims. That look, this Muhammad guy, which we believe is the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, in all due respect, you know, he just borrowed from his people. He borrowed from his people, and he borrowed from the Jews, and he borrowed. They never mentioned that he took from. That it's like a borrowing from the various Arabic speaking peoples. They never mentioned that. They always try to go back and say he borrowed from the Christians and the Jews. But one of the things that would have been said is that he borrowed from the Arabic speakers, their techniques. And it's known that one of the things that was happening with the people of Quraysh at that time is that the Quran was something that was strange to them, but it was not their poetry. And when we study their poetry through the science of arud, we understand that there's a difference in flow and style. That's why the Quran is not a byproduct of the Arab mind, like the nationalists had said, Arab nationalists had said. The Quran changed the Arabic language. It changed the meanings of the Arabic language. The usage, it changed it. It wasn't the way that they used it. So here, these ayat of the Quran that Sheikh Abdullah Daraz is bringing together, they're a thematic study on how it is that the Quran is distinguishing the Prophet والسلام, as a person separate with a separate voice than the voice of the Quran. Right? You were not with them when they drew lots as to which of them should be Maryam's garden. You were not with them. That is the brothers of Yusuf. You were not on the sunset slope when we imposed the law on Musa. You have never been able to recite any book that came before, nor did you ever transcribe one with your own hand. We know that writing was not dominant either. You know, only some of the Sahaba, they knew how to write though, but it was not something that was widespread. So he goes down. We do not say that no one. We go down. So after the six right there, we do not say that no one among the Arabs had ever known the names of some of the past prophets or past communities, or had a general idea of the destruction that overwhelmed the peoples of Ad and Thamud, or the great floods at the time of Noah. Such general notions rarely ever remain unknown. Sheikh Abdullah Daraz does something very amazing. And that's why I believe that some of the flow that we encounter at times in this book is coming from the translator. Because Sheikh Abdullah Daraz is very systematic. You see it in the Arabic. So the point here is he's saying what's unique is not the general nature of the story. What's unique is that the Prophet is able to give details about these things, right? The Prophet is able to give details. Anyone can relate a story and know the general substance. Very few will know the details of what took place. So such general notions rarely ever remain unknown to any person wherever he lives, in desert or city. So even geographical boundaries here don't matter, because general details can be known in whatever geographical boundary a person is in. The important part is that which concerns minute details only available in well-researched books giving accurate accounts. That's another issue. It's not just giving details, but making sure that those details are accurate. Such knowledge was totally unavailable to the Arabs, who were largely an illiterate people. I don't know if I want to buy that whole illiteracy thing though, right? The only thing that has value in is to support the idea that those are things that are in books, those details. And if the Arabic peoples were in illiterate peoples for the most part, then how is it that they would have access to those books? That's where the idea of literacy, writing, in terms of writing, makes sense. But outside of that, writing was, writing was okay, but that doesn't mean that it was the greatest standard. You get what I'm saying? So, are we clear on what I'm saying, or I'm mumbling? Writing is not a standard for knowledge, people. Writing is a standard for access to knowledge that's preserved in a certain way. Walter Mignolo from Duke, he wrote a book. I have it somewhere. It's called The darker side of the Renaissance. Okay? The book is called The Darker Side of the Renaissance. Literacy, Territoriality, and Colonization is another one as well. Let me see. Hold on a second. Yeah, it's the same one, different cover. In that book, he argues that there were different techniques of communicating knowledge, and we know that now. People like even with the Palestinians, you see this right here. This is not Palestinian, but this is more native or indigenous to the Americas. These embroideries or these patterns, I should say, they have certain messages they communicate. The Palestinians, according to the different tribes, they the dresses of the women, the embroidery communicates certain realities of what people or what tribe they're from. Isn't that true, Tariq? Is Tariq still with us?
It shows he's logged in. Maybe he stepped away.
Yes, that's true. We actually are working on a fashion show for the different Tatris from the different regions of Palestine. They represent different parts of the culture from the different regions and what the region is known for.
Yeah, even you find like the African Americans here earlier on, they used to use braids. Their braids were used to communicate messaging. You know what I'm saying? And even through music, it was known to be the case. You go to places in Africa, depending where you go, and the way that stone is used was used to communicate. Whether you go to Central Africa, Nubia, Egypt, wherever, you writing is one technique. Writing is one technique of communicating knowledge. And the reason why I say that is because when we're talking about people being illiterate, we have to be careful not to be chauvinist in thinking that, okay, writing is, we're at some high level. In many regards, people are computer literate. That's the new literacy. And we're, in many cases, dumber than I don't know what. You know what I'm saying? In terms of being able to access our memory, being able to come up with creative thought, so on and so forth. And so we have to be careful that we don't assume that they were not intelligent and that they didn't have ways of dealing with knowledge. We know that they had ways of tracking in the desert that are unprecedented. You understand? They had like a natural GPS with understanding how to navigate. But here is talking about a specific type of knowledge that would have to have been preserved in books, and you can only access it if you had the ability to read and to study, because they're historical documents. That's it's an approach to proving the prophethood of the Prophet Muhammad والسلام, and it's an approach to distinguishing the knowledge of the Quran from other types of knowledge. He says, yet you find accurate accounts of such history in the Quran, even figures correspond perfectly in the story of Noah as related in the Quran. As people have gone and done archaeological work as well, to work with these things that are said in the Quran, which I find it to be very interesting. I don't know 100% where a lot of that work has gone, but one thing to be sure is that no one can argue against the authenticity of the Quran. Even if you believe that the Prophet Muhammad والسلام, was the author of the Quran, there's no book on the face of the earth that has been intact and can be read by large mass of people with understanding except the Quran. You can say something, maybe the Egyptian hieroglyphics have been around for a while, or something in China, whatever, because the Chinese, they have their pictograph language, and it has been, a language which has kind of remained for a while, but there's no language like the Arabic language. And that's not something said because we're Muslim or this, that, whatever. There's no language like the Arabic language that has remained accessible, very ancient, and it allows us at the same time to access the Quran. The danger of contemporary Arabic dialects, whether it's Egyptian or Saudi or whatever it may be, is that those are really not the Arabic language, and the colonial powers made every effort to make the street slang systems into formal languages to distort our access to uh, Fusha and its various dialects. There's dialects. Egyptian is not a dialect. The Sudanese is not a dialect. Moroccan is not a dialect. Those are distortions of the Arabic language as we knew it. Their languages now in their own right, but they're not the Arabic language. They became languages in their own right because their grammar is studied and they be formalized, and that was done intentionally. Effort was given to those modalities of communication, which became the byproduct of interactions with the English colonists and the French colonists and so on and so forth. And it became a mixture of different, words and forms of expression. Egyptian Arabic has a lot of uh, Turkish in it and other languages, and so on and so forth. But the Fusha and its dialects, that's something that we have to really consider. And I was thinking about this the other day, how the Prophet ﷺ knew the dialects of the Arabs. And so when you know the language of the people, it's like you know them somewhat. So that's a different reality than what we have today. We have to realize that those dialects are very important. The early dialects are very important because they give us a lot of nuance and they cross over into the qira'at of the Quran, which give nuance, which give a lot of nuance. And so we lose meaning even when we just read one qira'ah. That's why some tafsir books that are really well established, one of the things that they are bringing always is there another qira'ah? Is there another reading here? Because we read the Quran as though it's only one qira'ah, mostly hafs. But we don't read the Quran in light of its different forms of recitation, which come back to a certain extent to the dialects. So let me just read a little more here. We can stop where we stopped last time we read this section, which is in the next chapter. So there, the argument is that the details is something that's unique. They were not available to the Arabs at that time. Yet you find accurate accounts of such a history in the Quran. Even figures correspond perfectly. The story of Noah, as related in the Quran, alayhi salatu wasalam, he's said to have lived among his people for a thousand years. That's 50. And in the book of Genesis, we read that he lived 950 years. The people of the cave are reported in the books of the Jews and the Christians to have remained in their cave for 300 Gregorian years. In the Quran, they are mentioned to have stayed 300 years and 9. These 9 account for the difference between the Gregorian and lunar calendars. Consider this accurate arithmetic in a community of illiterate people who did not write or calculate. This is where we stopped the last time. 2:26:23. And then we moved. Actually, we finished the rest of the page. It is certainly an amazing story. Here is an unlettered man who lives in a community of unlettered people, attending their gatherings as long as they are free of falsehood and frivolity, leading a normal life, earning his family's living, working as a paid shepherd or merchant. He had no contact with scholars of any type. He lived in such circumstances for more than 40 years. Then all of a sudden he comes up with statements the like of which he has never uttered in the past, nor mentioned to anyone before. He says about communities of older times what could only be gathered from books of treasured by scholars. Is it in such matters that those ignorant non-believers claim that he made a rational conclusion or gathered an inspiration? What logic supports the claim that this newly observed stage was a natural outcome of the preceding illiterate stage? You know, the idea of a evolution of communities, so that now you're beginning to see the rise of literacy in this community and this knowledge is advanced. You know, he's saying, Sheikh Abdul, what evidence is there to make that claim? You know, Carl Jaspers calls it the axial age. Carl Jasper, the philosopher, Axial. He says that around the same time globally, uh, you start to see all these figures pop up like Buddha, Muhammad, and all this. He talks in that language. Although we believe in the Prophet Muhammad, we don't believe in just the idea that he's just a normal human being with no support from revelation. So he says all these figures pop up in the history of human beings, and they take humanity to another level of understanding. So that type of claim is what he's talking about. There's no escaping the rational conclusion that this sudden transformation was the result of some totally different cause that should be sought away from the limitation of his own soul or the sort of scanty information that was available to them. So there's no escaping the rational conclusion that this sudden transformation was the result of some totally different cause that should be sought away from the limitation of his own soul. Himself is not the byproduct of his own effort, and is not the byproduct of the information that was scant available to him. And he says the atheist Arabs of the days of ignorance were more logical in their explanation of this phenomena and had a better understanding of this secret than the later day atheists. I like that piece. You know what I'm saying? Those Arabs did not say that he invented these stories out of personal inspiration. What they claimed was that he must have received knowledge that was not available to him previously, and that he studied such knowledge thoroughly in order to learn what he had not known. Thus, the translation of the Quran, do we give many facets of our revelations, and thus they may say, you have learnt it well. They say fables of the ancient times, which he has caused to be written down, so that they might be read out to him at the morning and evening. They themselves were struggling with what is uh, the Quran. Was that a little clear, or no? It was kind of confused what everything that was said for the most part.
No, that made good perfect sense. Thank you for breaking it down in depth and detail. Because I think when we go to different classes, it's just stated as a known fact. The Quran was revelation. The Prophet ﷺ was unlettered,
Yep.
and it's just on the surface. Nobody takes the time to really dig deep into like the who, what, where, why, and dissect every angle and perception and argument, because that's what we come across in society, like out the
Mm-hmm.
blue. I was sitting at a park the other day, and somebody, a group just came up to me out of nowhere, and started trying to debate about religion and salvation. And so we have to be prepared to really not debate, but really fully have a conviction based on knowledge why we
For
believe what we
ourselves,
believe. And
for
mhm.
ourselves. That's why, in some ways, I get the, Sheikh Abdullah Daraz is he's uh he's doing a service, but I kind of feel that this is directed in many ways to the. Let me be clear on what I'm saying. Sheikh Abdullah Daraz is doing a service in that he's he's responding to some ideas that are out there amongst the non-Muslims that could be applied to the Quran and make our belief problematic in the Quran, in the Prophet, and eventually in Allah. But I feel as though, and I want to go back over the Arabic again. I went through this before, this struggle with myself. I'm not so sure that he's using that language that the translator is using in the same way. And the reason why I'm harping on that is because I personally think that we need to know these. This is how we need to teach our belief in the Quran, not maybe at the basic level, but at the intermediate level. When we say we believe in the Quran, we believe in the Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam, we need to be able to show how it is that the Quran itself distinguishes between the Prophet and his knowledge base and Allah as the giver of the Quran. That's important. Even many of us, to be honest with you, everything that Sheikh Abdullah Daraz is saying, to be honest with you, doesn't come up in the books of tafsir. Not this way. That's why some people say that Sheikh Abdullah Daraz is a genius, and this point. What he did with the few ayat that he brought forward is a thematic commentary of the Quran. He brought together ayat to show in different places of the Quran how it is that it distinguishes between itself, the Quran, how it distinguishes between itself and the Prophet Muhammad, and puts the two in two separate realms, and shows how the Quran is addressing the Prophet. Even from a literary standpoint, is very genius in the sense that it makes you or forces you to be more sensitive to what the scholars of rhetoric or balagha, they call it al-iltifat. And that's the iltifat is when the Quran is changing for an address. Who's being addressed? What person is being addressed? It can go from the singular to the plural, from the person that's present to the person that is not present, that type of thing. So those shifts, literary shifts, are extremely important to really appreciate the Quran. When you're sensitive to those shifts, how the Quran is shifting in address, you know what I'm saying? How the Quran can be at one moment commanding Kul Muhammad, you know what I'm saying? It may not say Muhammad, but it says Kul, right? It says say. And then, like for instance, how you can have that in Surah Yusuf, and it can be like the Quran is commanding the Prophet Yusuf alayhi salatu wasalam, but in reality is commanding the Prophet Muhammad at the same time and us. So, how the Quran is drawing us into the life of Yusuf, but then at the same time, the Quran is really speaking to Muhammad and the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, and his situation, and then at the same time, it pulls out and is speaking to us in our time period. That's an amazing way of addressing, because you're being dragged into the story of Yusuf alayhi salatu wasalam. And then when you know the context, you know that the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam is being reaffirmed and consoled by Allah in a situation which is just chaotic and crisis and full of hardship and oppression, and the Quran is coming to comfort and to guide. So you get an understanding of exactly how it is that the Quran is being, applied to that set of circumstances, situations. And then we're given the blessing and the chance for the Quran not just to be a history book about what took place, but for us to get lessons from ourselves, because the Quran addresses ourselves. And I think in part, and some people have claimed this, Sheikh Abdullah Draz is playing these games, intellectual games, so to speak. And I'm not saying that in a way that is belittling. Games are serious. Saying like he's playing this game, it has its rules. Okay, we're gonna play this game, the literary game. We're gonna play the psychological game. We're gonna play the rational game. We're gonna play the history game. And we're gonna show you from the angle of history, from the angle of language, from the angle of reason, from the angle of psychology, who the prophet is. And that's a way uh, that is a way of presenting information that speaks to us as modern people, so to speak. And in our ability, the way that we think, even that idea, is the Quran the byproduct of just deep reflection? That's an important. We have to be within our minds. We have to come to terms with that. Is it just a nice, is it just like any other book of any philosophy book, whatever, or part of Iman is to believe not. But okay, we're told don't believe that, but do we know that reality? And that's what he does for us.
Mm-hmm.
That's what he does. He builds out for us
Yeah, and I think what
a
differentiates
framework.
Islam from other ideologies is that we can't just focus on, well, we just believe in one God. Like, we have to have conviction that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was the final messenger. And sometimes it's hard to wrap my brain around that because of the lack of knowledge of who he was. So it's really important.
We ran into a situation last night. I had an event at the masjid yesterday, and so one of the brothers came. He gave a talk on the introduction to Islamic psychology. It was in general pretty okay, but then to kind of prove his point psychologically, because he wanted to talk about trauma and overcoming trauma, he starts going into the issue that the Prophet ﷺ, that claim, wanted to throw himself over a cliff to prove his point of trauma. And I told them, hold on a second. Like, first of all, you may find it in hadith and you may find it in Sirah books, but it doesn't mean that it's something that's totally accepted, or it doesn't mean that we should present it to the community in this way. Because once we start opening the door, and then he went further, he was like, oh, when the revelation first came, he was traumatized. And I said, like, so the thing that we don't understand is that those are psychological readings and psychology changes. There's a certain, and you and I, Aliyah, we both know that there's a definition that's being used for trauma. Trauma is not just an ordeal, or it's not just a situation that's overburdening. Trauma, in order to be designated as having trauma, it has to disrupt your flow of life, where you become uh, incapable of continuing with the norm. So it's not just like you go through a period of time for a short period of time and then you overcome it. And the danger of when we start having these psychological readings is that if we don't know how to handle that type of stuff, we start creating more doubt than anything. Because now you're saying that the prophet had suicidal tendencies, which may be beneficial to someone that has suicidal tendencies, but how are you gonna get that person out? How are you gonna get that person out of that? And I've heard some scholars even reject the whole notion totally. You know what I'm saying? So that becomes the issue when we start exploring these things. We have to be careful of what direction that we're going in, and the name of speaking about the humanity of the Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam.
Right.
And this is what he's doing. Abdul Daraz is doing the opposite. He's showing us where's the humanity of the Prophet and where can you go on human knowledge. And then he's saying, but we're over here. What we're dealing with is distinct from human achievement and human knowledge. It's what we call revelation. You know, that's an important point. I don't know if there's any comments before we go. We kind of probably stayed above our time, fortunately. But we can end here, inshallah.
So we'll continue on with chapter 3 next week, inshallah, and then once we finish, because I know chapter 3 is pretty long. And then we'll jump,
Yep.
and then we'll go over to 9 and 10. Now, if we jump over to 9 and 10, are we gonna be able to like just catch the
Yeah,
flow?
because
Are we gonna be like coming
because
from?
most of that is dealing with thematic tafsir.
Okay.
It's dealing with thematic tafsir. And so we'll catch the flow. The 28th and the 4th, I'm not gonna be around
The
because I'm
28th.
going on Umrah.
MashaAllah. Allahu Akbar. Good. Keep us in your dua.
Inshallah. Yeah. So just a heads up on that, inshallah.
Okay.
Okay, inshallah. So I have like a few. I'm just looking at my calendar. Okay, all right. So inshallah. So let's continue. Yes, and I think that it. I don't know if today was a little clear or made sense, but may Allah, make it easy, inshallah. And I appreciate everybody's patience and time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I think Wafat, weren't we supposed to meet? I don't know if she left already.
No, I'm still here. It's okay. I can call you about it another time, inshallah, if you are available.
Yeah, when do you want to talk?
Are you available? Do you have any availability today or tomorrow?
Inshallah.
Okay,
Inshallah.
you let me know a good time for you. I'm available, inshallah.
What about tomorrow morning? Or late in the late today sometime?
Yeah, tomorrow morning works.
Okay, inshallah. All right then. Okay, give my salams to the family. Okay, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. والعصر إن الإنسان في خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر ونستغفر الله ونتوب إليه. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. مع السلامة. في الله.
Assalam.